Mario, good evening.
Hello, good evening, Yaakov.
How are you?
Good, thank God.
Baruch Hashem. Wonderful.
Hi, Abe.
Hello, how is everybody?
Hi,
How are
everyone.
you?
Good evening.
Hello. Good evening.
Hi, Sonny.
How are you?
Good, thank God. And you?
Baruch Hashem. Another week has gone by.
Another week.
Another week is coming.
I like that better.
Hi, Bernie.
Hi, Mario. How are you?
Good, thank God. And you?
Fine, thank you. It's almost Rosh Chodesh. Purim's around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
The magic word, Pesach. We have no women on the call, so there's not a general panic, but if there were, there would be.
Sure enough.
Hi, Ernie.
Shalom Aleichem, everybody.
Ernie.
I wanted to show everybody that we're getting a lot more people in my home. There's Saul and there's Jerry.
And 6 more are waiting at the door.
Yeah, so everyone is invited if they can. Okay.
Hey, Bernie, are you hearing me? Is Bernie hearing me?
Yeah, Bernie hears you.
Bernie,
Yeah, I hear you.
Call up Genauer. I just spoke to him. Says nobody's calling him. See how he's doing. I just spoke to him.
Genauer
He
was
very
just,
sick.
Genauer was just in our shear. I didn't know he was sick.
When?
Just like
Yeah,
that
he had a whole heart thing. Been sitting in bed there on the phone, on the Zoom, not on the.
Okay, good to hear.
Okay. We're on page 190. We had learned the Bir Agra regarding, we're dealing with the issue of Birchas HaTorah and Noshim. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Afal pi shenoshim pturos yecholos liskoa. Even though they're potter from blowing the shofar, they can blow. V'chein acher sheyotza kvar. If someone has fulfilled the mitzvah of shofar already, Yachol litko lo tzion. He can blow for them if they have not been yotze yet. Of course, the sheet of the Sfardim, of the Maron, of Yosef Karo, aval ein mevarchos v'lo yevarchu lahem. They held that, for example, a woman could shake the lulav on Sukkot, but would not make the bracha. The Ramah, who we find, that minik shanoshim mevarchos al mitzvah seseshes man groma. Al ken gam kan tevarchen ala atzman. So that's the machlokes Ashkenazim and Sephardic psak, that when our women decide to perform a mitzvah that they're technically exempt from, like any mitzvah tied to time, like shofar blowing or shaking the lulav. So the Sephardim say they can do the mitzvah itself, but no make a bracha on it. But the Ramah and we Ashkenazim follow the procedure that they do make a bracha. According to the Shulchan Aruch, though, who rules in accordance with other Rishonim that women may not recite bracha under such circumstances, women must also refrain from reciting Birchas HaTorah, since they are exempt from the mitzvah of learning Torah. Therefore, the Gra's approach cannot explain the position of the Shulchan Aruch, for which the explanations offered by the Maharil are still necessary. This was what we discussed last week, that the Maharil said that any opposition to women's learning Torah only applied to the oral Torah, not to the written Torah. So women could recite Birchas Torah if they're going to learn the written Torah. That since women are obligated in Tefillah, their korbanos is part of Tefillah, and therefore, if you're going to recite korbanos, you need to say Birchas Torah.
I have a question. Go back to the first one. Afal pi shenoshim pturos. All right.
Sorry.
Mitzvah say shazman grab.
Right. I understand.
Mitzvah's tied to time.
My question is, what is they're allowed to blast automatically when they say the woman is patur? Why do you need to say yechol to co-op that they may blast?
Because
patur means that they're patur from doing any.
they're exempt.
They're exempt.
So you might have thought that because you're patur, you're not allowed to do the mitzvah. So the Shulchan Aruch is telling us no, they can do it.
So when you see the word patur,
You're exempt.
You're exempt always. In other words, you're never chayiv to do that.
You're not chayiv. They're not obligated to do
They're
it.
not obligated.
By
That's it.
doing it,
But they could do it. But they could do it.
It's a reshus for them. They have permission to do it.
What about the bracha v'tzivanu?
So you're asking on the Ramah. You're asking on the Ramah. The Ramah says that our women Ashkenazim are allowed to make the bracha. So you're saying, well, if they're not mitzvah, how can they say v'tzivanu? Yaakov, that's your question, right?
That's the observation, yeah.
Well, so we go back to what we just said about the Maril, that they, in some aspect, they're mitzvah. The part of for example, the Maril also said, those things that they need to learn, like nida, like basar b'chala, like the various things that are applicable to them, to that extent, they fall under Vitzivanu. The Gra also said, the Gra said, based on the Ramah, that even though they're not necessarily mitzvah, they're allowed to make the bracha. The Ramah didn't give us a reason The Ramah just said they can make the bracha. It didn't. The Ramah didn't say, "Oh, what about Vitzivanu?" He wasn't bothered by it. Or you can rely on the Mariel, who gave us the reasons why women have some shaykhs to the bracha as well. Now, the Bir Alocha, who is the Chafetz Chaim in the Mishnah Brura, whenever he wants to go into depth on a certain halacha that he quotes in Mishnah Brura, he'll have a little Bir Alocha there. So the Bir Alocha contends that there's a nafka mina that derives from which reasoning is the basis for women reciting Birchas HaTorah. May women reciting the bracha exempt men of their own obligation. We know men have a chiyuv, so and women are not mechuyev, but they're allowed to if they want, and they make a bracha. So now the shaila is, let's say there's a man next to the woman, and he doesn't know how to make a bracha. Can the woman be motzi the man when she makes her bracha?
There's different levels of chiyuv, no?
So very good. According to the arguments presented by the Beis Yosef in the name of the Mariel, the Birchas HaTorah have as much relevance for women as they do for men. And therefore women may exempt men from their obligation. However, according to Vilna Gaon, women are fundamentally exempt from reciting any blessings related to the Torah. But they may recite them voluntarily, as in all other time-bound positive commandments. The Gra basically was saying, we have a din that women are potter for mitzvah says Zman Grama. But if they choose to do the mitzvah, they can make the bracha. But he didn't give a svara as to why. The Mariel gave a svara why women are connected to Birchas HaTorah. We went through the three of them again. So according to the Mariel approach, women have a real chiyuv. They would be able to exempt a man by her saying the bracha and him answering amen, because they're in same, like Abe said, in some ways they have a similar connection to the chiyuv.
Why didn't they use a clause that's why you're saying, I agree with you. That's why it says, again, I'm going back to the patur. That's why it says women are patur from reciting the bracha, okay? However, by saying the word patur, reciting the bracha means it should have said women are not
Pater
allowed.
from the mitzvah.
Yeah,
Pater
but
from the
women are
mitzvah.
not allowed to say the bracha. In other words,
The
that's why we're saying that.
The Shulchan Aruch actually holds that they can shake the lulav but
Yes.
not make the bracha. The Ramah says they can shake the
But they
lulav
say-
and make the bracha.
Oh, okay, so there's.
However, according to Vilna Grove, they're potter. Consequently, women would be unable to exempt men from their obligation to recite the bracha. It's a lumdish issue, but it's nice. Says the Bir Alocha Noshim Avarchos. Hatada chayeves lilmod adinim shalem. Number one, they have to study they're required. Someone who has hilchos nida, or they have to run the kitchen, they're required to know those dinim. It's not just the rishus, and therefore the od chayeves lomer parshas hakarbonos, like we said, they have to recite the korbanos and tefillah. Im kein koya bracha al zeh. So they have shaykhs to this bracha. Well, if he's there time, you call Latzi Birchas HaTorah Sa'ish. The Chen Kosav Prima Godim Badei. The Prima Godim the favor says that a woman can exempt a man with the bracha. However, v'hagrob b'yuro choylek al zeh. Hatam ayin shab. Elatam de mavarchos suda after p'tir mitor mikol mokem b'chos levarch v'lomer v'tzivonu. Like what Jacob Goldfinger wanted to say, that even though technically they're potter from the mitzvah, they can say v'tzivonu. The lo griya mikol mitzvah sasei shaz man groma de kaimel adicholos levarch lem. It's no difference than all other brachos that they're allowed to say. If he's saying yicholos lo tziseish, based on that svara, they would not be able to be motzi the man. The cotton shigil lechunuch. You have a 10-year-old boy. 10-year-old boy, a father has a chiyuv, only midrabanan, to teach his child about mitzvos. So if for some reason the father doesn't know how to recite a bracha, can the cotton be mostly the father? No, because this is what Abe said. They're not on the same level. The man is on a chiyuv midoraisa to recite Birchas HaTorah. The child's chiyuv is only midrabanan al chinuch. A drabanan cannot come to be motzi the doraisa dika status. That's what the Bir Halacha says. Eina yachol lotzis a gadol b'berachas al fi mash soivim arbe poskim the berachas are having a Torah. Which we went through in detail last week, whether Birchas HaTorah is M'Rabbanan, Midoraisa. We came out that it's most poskim hold that it's Midoraisa. Page 192. We learned in the Shir that according to the Smag, the Sefer Mitzvahs Gedolos, the Smag was a collector of like Taryag Mitzvahs. He lived in the year 1900, very early, times of the Gaonim. Women recite Birchas HaTorah because they are required to learn those laws which apply to them. Like we said, Taras HaMishpacha, Hilchos Taruviz, Basar B'Cholov. However, this position would seem to conflict with the discussion in the Gemara Menachos Mem Beis Amid Beis. Sholach Rav Chia B'Reid Rav Huna Mishmeid Rav Yochanan. Rav Chia, the son of Rav Huna, sent the following in the name of Rav Yochanan. Al Tefillin Shel Yad Oimer. What brachos do you make on Tefillin? So when you put the Tefillin Shel Yad, you say Baruch Atah Hashem Hashem Mitzvah Laniach Tefillin. Then you put your Tefillin Shel Roshan. Oimer, Baruch Hashem Hashem Mitzvah Tzveno Amitzvah Tefillin, V'ilu Lasos Tefillin Lo Mavarech. There seems to be a bracha when we're loivesh tefillin, when we put on tefillin. How come there's no bracha when the soifer makes the tefillin? Ela Lavainu Taima Kol Mitzvah Dasiyasa Gmar Mitzvah. If there is an action associated with a mitzvah, we make the bracha by the Gmar mitzvah, when you finish it. So for example, Mila. Well, one shnit, it's the start and the beginning. So there, since the Asiya is the Gmar mitzvah, you make a bracha. The Chol mitzvah dasiyos lav Gmar mitzvah. For example, another very good is Sukkah. We don't make a bracha on the asiyas sukkah because the Gemar mitzvah is when we actually sit in the sukkah and we make a bracha leished b'sukkah. The Gemara wants to say as well, kol mitzvah dasiyos lav Gemar mitzvah kegon tefillin eino tzarich levarich. When the soifer finishes the tefillin, that's not the Gemar mitzvah. The Gemar mitzvah is when the person puts on the tefillin. You could think the same thing by a soifer. Writing a Megillah.
So when he does his own film, let's say he prepares his own film,
he still wouldn't do it.
Would he still
no,
say no?
He still wouldn't make the bracha until he put it on, because that's the final action of the mitzvah. The final action of the mitzvah is not just to make the tefillin and let it sit there.
No, but he's going to make the film, then he's going to put it on.
And then he makes the bracha.
Then he makes.
He says, so therefore, there's a stage in the mitzvah where there's no bracha, i.e., when the soifer makes the tefillin, there's no bracha. Similarly, when he makes the Megillah, there's no bracha. It's only when the Baal Koire lanes al Mikra Megillah, that's the Gemar mitzvah. That's the rule that the Gemara tells us.
Sefer Torah again. What is Sefer Torah? When does he make a bracha when he finishes writing?
No, we don't. You've been to many Siyumei MaTorah. There's no bracha made there. So there are people who are makpid, like Sidney Teichman. Is Sidney on the line?
What are you saying?
Well, when Sidney made it, the Tolner Rebbe was here, and he was makpid that I was the Balkar. I laned the last part of the Dvorim.
Right.
Why? Because and he called up 3 people for an aliyah. Because the bracha, you understand, he wanted to make the Gemar Malacha. Could be, I've never seen that before, but it was when the Tolner Rebbe was at Young Israel Rankov Park. By that siyum.
You heard my question on the mezuzah, same thing. When they make the clock for the mezuzah.
Same thing. When he finishes writing the mezuzah, you only do it when you put it on. Now, according to the Gemara, one does not recite a bracha on writing tefillin, since one does not fulfill the mitzvah at that time. Clearly then, In the case of an action which is a preparatory step to the mitzvah, which facilitates a mitzvah, but is not the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah, no bracha is mandated. Consequently, if one understands that the basic value of women's Torah study is merely hechsher mitzvah, she has to do taras mishpacha, so she has to know about it. So they're going to make an argument. Why would this be grounds for citing a bracha, since her learning has been declared a hechsher mitzvah only? That's the kasha that's being asked here. To answer this question, we should note that there are two types of brachos: birchas ha-mitzvos, blessing upon the performance of mitzvah, al netilas lulav, laniach tefillin, or al mitzvahs tefillin. These are birchos ha-mitzvah. These are brachos made prior to performing a mitzvah. Then there are brachos birchas ha-shvach. Sometimes we'll make a bracha to praise Hashem. The Ramban writes that birchas ha-Torah is not a function of the classic birchas ha-mitzvah, but rather birchas ha-shvach. That when we say la'asok b'divrei Torah, it's not a bracha preceding the performance of a mitzvah. We're praising Hashem. Shenitztavinu lodos lishmo yizborach b'choleis, shenikra b'torah la'toiv ha'gdolah shasalo b'titot Torah seinu eleinu. The Ramban says we have to make a bracha to Hashem every time we read the Torah on the great goodness that He did for us by giving us the Torah. This, He's giving us the facility by which to inherit Olam Haba. Now, the Brisker Rav, this Brisker Rav, I actually used for one of my daughter's Bas Mitzvah, the one we're going to learn. The Brisker Rav seems to accept this approach as well. He writes in the name of his father, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, that women should recite Birchas HaTorah, since the brachas are not merely a preparatory action for Torah study, but rather Torah itself requires a bracha due to its greatness. He says, people asked, Kashas, how can women make a Birchas HaTorah their potter? Shomati, mipi Agona Chosid, who was his father, Abi Moiri, Rav Chaim Brisker. It's not like when we shake the lulav, we are being mekayim the mitzvahs of lulav. There's a kiyuma mitzvah of hanachas tefillah. Here, the bracha is not on the kiyuma mitzvah. Raktehu din bifnei atzmo. It's on the cheftza of Torah. Torah is a cheftza. Torah is a thing in itself, and we're making a bracha on it. The Torah boy bracha. You're going to read Torah, it needs a bracha. It's an equation. It's a cheftza of something that has kedusha and requires Torah, requires a bracha. You'll feel up a bracha staff chafalef, and he brings a source there in bracha. Oh, this approach sheds new light on women's obligation to recite Birchas HaTorah. The apparent objections to women reciting Birchas HaTorah are based on the presumption that Birchas HaTorah serve the function of a formal Birchas HaMitzvah, right? Just like you make a bracha before shaking the lulav, you make a bracha before reading Torah. It was from that angle that the Gaon of Vilna raised his objections, which we learned. However, if we view the Birchas HaTorah as functioning primarily as Birchas HaShvach, as a praise, it's readily apparent that women should also recite the Birchas HaTorah.
What about Aliyah? They make a bracha of an Aliyah. That's Birchas HaShavach.
That's right. That's the Birchas HaTorah that you make on the itzumo of Torah itself, on the chetz of Torah itself. We're dealing now in the concept of women.
Right.
Women don't make enough.
But maybe a woman should be with no problem at all.
A woman, according to strict halacha, women can have one of the Sheva Kruim. They can be called up to have an aliyah.
Yes.
We're going to learn that, I'm sure, in depth in the Tzurba M'Rabanan.
But it's not considered.
It's not covered at tzibur. We don't allow a woman to do it because it's not modest to be amongst men, and they're doing it. But Meikar Adin, they're allowed to do it. So it fulfills everything we're saying.
Right.
If they would make the bracha because it's a birchas hashvach for them.
Right.
because they're praising the fact that the Torah was given to Gans Klal Yisrael. This corresponds to the standard test of Birchas HaShvach, which apply to women as much as they apply to men. Women make brachos for Shvach. This is an important message that applies to both women and men. According to the Griz that we learned tonight, Birchas HaTorah reminds us that our Birchas HaTorah does not relate only to the Torah we study that day. Even one who does not study much Torah must still recognize when reciting the bracha how critical Torah is to our existence as a people as a whole. One who acknowledges and appreciates the importance of Torah and thanks Hashem for it within the Birchas HaTorah, even if he or she does not have the ability to study it at length, can still truly connect themselves to Torah and praise Hashem for the amazing treasure that we have received.
The bracha lasoik doesn't say learning, does it?
Lasik means to delve into, is to occupy yourself with. And I hear what it's more of a language of a mitzvah. That bracha lasoik b'divrei Torah sounds more like this, like the language of a birchas mitzvah.
You could say the opposite. You could say, lasoik, this is my business. Your whole day, whatever you do, is guided by the Torah. So it doesn't mean only learning, like the Gemara, but you're doing your whole life. That's my ASIC. That's my business.
So it's still a birchas hashvach according to your approach?
That's what I'm saying.
It's still a birchas hashvach?
Yeah.
Okay, I hear it.
Now specifically, because on the Sefer Torah, we say Asher Bo Chabonu.
Yes.
But in Shachas, we say Lasoik.
You say both. Remember, you say all three brachas in the morning.
Asher Nosan Lanu is another one. There are three brachas.
But in the morning, you say lasoik, you say harevna, which ends with a bracha, and then you say asher b'charbonu. You say all three in the morning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Didn't we say last week that the reason why we say Yivarecha and then from Mishnah is that it shouldn't be a bracha v'atola?
You want to say it. You want to say Torah right away, so that
because there could be a bracha
Correct.
v'atola issue.
Correct.
So according to this, there's no issue, because even if you didn't learn, just the
Correct. According to the Griz's approach, it's not a birchas mitzvah. And based on that, then all of these other, maybe you were fulfilling all of the opinions. That is, though, the opinions that say there is a birchas mitzvah, so then you have the learning of the Torah right afterwards.
Okay.
I think all the points that have been made have been very strong points.
If you, let's say Monday comes around, you're listening to the Torah and the thing, and you make the brachos beforehand, everybody, the yishul and the davening, you fulfilled the mitzvah of making a bracha before the learning. Then all of a sudden, 2 hours later, you pick up a Mishnah.
It covers
it covers
the
entire
24
day.
hours.
It covers 24 hours.
Correct.
You know that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky never slept Shabbos afternoon.
Okay.
You know why? He had a suffix if he has to say Birchas HaTorah if he went to sleep.
Okay. That goes to Jerry's point. Goes to Jerry's question. Because you had a hesach hadas.
If you sleep, half an hour is not a problem. But if you sleep 2 hours, maybe there would be.
Right.
So he didn't want to have a suffix.
Oh my God.
We had that last week, right? 20 to 30 minutes. We had that. Okay, very good. Any other questions or points that anybody want to make before we go on to page 201? What content necessitates a birchas Torah? What actual Torah that if you're going to learn it, it requires a birchas Torah? The Gemara in Brachos discusses which of the subject matters of Torah learning generate a chiyuv to recite birchas Torah. So this is Masechta Brachos Yud Aleph. Amar Ravuna lemikra tzarich levarach ulemedrash ein tzarich levarach. Mikra is words of Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. But Medrash, like Medrash Rabbah, Mechilta, Sifri, Sifra, the midrashic explanations of the Tanoim on the Mikra, according to Rav Huna, doesn't need a bracha. Rav Elazar Amar Mikra Ula Midrash Tzarech Levarach. He disagreed. He said Mikra and Medrash. But the Mishnah ain't Tzarech Levarach. The Mishnayos that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi organized, that doesn't require it. However, Rav Yochanan Amar Afla Mishnah Nam Tzarech Levarach. Aval the Talmud ain't Tzarech Levarach. But for Gemara, which was the Rav Yehuda Nasi closed out the Mishnayos in the year 180 CE, and then in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Yochanan and his colleagues, they wrote Talmud Yerushalmi, which was the explanations, the expansions of the Mishnayos that they learned in Eretz Yisrael. And Rav, who was a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, went back to Bavel, and his generation, Rav Shmuel, and the Amoraim that followed, they codified Talmud Bavli, which were comments on the Mishnah. And the way the Gemara is holding now, for Gemara you don't need a bracha. However, Rava Amar, Rava was already in the third or fourth generation. Abai and Rava were already in the third, fourth generation of the Amoraim. Afla Talmud Tzarech Levarach. The Amar of Chia Barashi, Zimnin Sagina v'Kamina Kamed de Rav. I was once in front of Rav. Remember, I mentioned Rav was the Talmud of Rebbe. L'snuyi Pirkin b'Sifra Devei Rav. They were studying Sifra, which is a medrash on Sefer Vayikra. Have a magdim v'komashi yadei baruch umasi lo pirkin. He washed his hands and made the bracha. I just want to.
What about Navi? What about Navi?
Tanakh. That everyone said lemikra tzarech levarach. For Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, there was no argument. Everyone said need a bracha. I just wanted to go through just something historically. That what are all these? We have Medrash Rabbah, Mechilta, and Tanchuma, and Sifri, and of course we have the Talmuds. What's going on here? There was a major battle in the times of the Tanoim, and eventually in the times of the Amoraim. There were those that darshaned halachas pasuk by pasuk. You went through Parshas Breishis, Parshas Noach, Parshas Lech Lecha, and every time there was a pasuk, they darshaned it. Sometimes it had halachic significance. If you look in Sifri and Sifra, there's a lot of halacha there. It's not just a gadita. It's not just medrashim. There's halacha. So from a mnemonic point of view, when I say mnemonic memory, there were those schools that said, you know what? How are we going to transmit Torah Shabbal Peh? We're going to transmit it through connection to Torah. Everyone reads every week, Breishis, Noach. They're going to remember pasuk by pasuk, midrashim. That's how we're going to transmit Torah Shabbal Peh. But remember, in Parshas Kiseitse, for example, where there's like 50 or 60 mitzvahs, it's all over the. It's not one subject matter. You might have mitzvos in a parsha that cover 30 or 40 different subject matters. So you notice Rav Yehuda Nasi, he gathered all of the Tanoic literature. What was the Tanoic? It was the same thing. Every Mishnah, one of the first questions the Gemara asks, Minolon, where do we know it from? We quote a pasuk. But the psukim are from all over the Torah. But what Rav Yehuda Nasi did, he did it by subject matter. Brachos, Shabbos, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkah, Tainis, Megillah. The way Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote down the Tanaitic literature, he did it by subject matter. And for Klal Yisrael, that they accepted that method as they went through the next 200-300 years. We don't paskin. The Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam didn't look in the midrashim to analyze halacha. They accepted Talmud Bavli, which was done in subject matter form. That became the accepted way. And so but you notice in the time of the Gemara, it hadn't been defined yet. They were questioning it. Maybe only Mikra, not Mishnah. Or maybe not Medrash, maybe not Talmud. Eventually, it all became Torah. Anybody have a comment on that?
Just to point out that
I mean,
the,
you agree with my analysis, you disagree?
You
I
called it a
think you're-
battle.
I think
I
you're
don't- I
right.
don't-
I would just note that the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, was redacted by Ravina and Ravashi. So Rav Yehuda Anasi did the Mishnah in the 2nd century, and I guess about 6th or 7th, you had Ravina and Ravashi who redacted the entire Talmud, to the Babylonian Talmud. And I think the English word for what you're talking about is a sugya, and it's pericope, which is a little, there you go. Pericope is the English word for sugya.
Okay, right? Remember, Ravina and Ravashi had to take all of the material that had gathered in the 200-300 years, and they had to organize it. Absolutely. In fact, when you go through the Daf Yomi, you see many sugyas end. For example, there's a problem in the Gemara, and the Gemara doesn't ever resolve it. Sometimes at the end, Ravashi, Amar Ravashi, he'll give you an answer. Meaning he didn't like that after, let's say, Rav and Shmuel and Abai Rava, they didn't resolve the issue. He ends up resolving the issue. Ela Amar Ravashi, and he's the final word on it. And of course, that goes along with our historical knowledge that Ravina and Ravashi were the redactors of the Talmud. But I was just dealing with this. There seemed to be a struggle for a while for Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, Tana Devei Chizkiah. There were schools of thought, and a lot of it was based on this issue. We're going to transmit Torah Sheba'al Peh, pasuk by pasuk, and that's why we have Tanaitic literature in Sifri, and Sifra, and Mechilta, and Tanchuma, and not all of them were early. Some of the midrashim are late. They're after Tana. They're after the Amoraim even. But some of them are early. And you just see that development in this Gemara. Anyways, the Gemara concludes with the opinion of Rava, who holds that one must recite Birchas HaTorah prior to learning Psukim, Mishnah, and Talmud. In light of this, many poskim understood that the practical halacha follows Rava, and a person must recite a bracha when learning any of the genres of Torah mentioned in the Gemara: Tanakh, Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch rules. Says the Shulchan Aruch in our sugya, Mem Zayin, Tzarach levarach bein lemikra, bein lemishnah, bein legemara. And says the Ramah, bein lemedrash. Because the Shulchan Aruch didn't mention medrash. Again, for this baby, since medrash is agadita, it's not really halachic. The Ramah says no, medrash too. According to one explanation, the reason for this is that the Mishnah and the Talmud serve as exposition of the verses of the Torah. And these also explore the fundamentals and underpinnings of the mitzvos. That's what the Talmid Rav Yonah and Brachas 5b say. According to others, all are included within the obligation of Birchas HaTorah because the basis for all was given on Mount Sinai. That's what the Balatanya says, the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Or because all of them are included in the term Torah. That's the Levush. The Levush followed the Ramah as one of the Achronim on Orach Chaim. What about broader categories of Torah? It is clear from these sources that the criteria for that which qualifies as Torah study encompasses a range of Torah subjects. We are still left to wonder of the status of other related disciplines, which still do not strictly fit these enumerated literary genres, particularly as the scope of Torah-oriented literature became wider and wider after the completion of the Talmud. Must one recite a bracha before learning Midrash Haggadah, or Machshava, Jewish thought and theology? Let's say you're going to read Rav Tzadok HaKohen, who lived in Lublin, 1880, 1890, wrote a lot about philosophy. You're going to read Maharal.
But inevitably, they're going to be quoting in these Psukim.
Right? So
You
you're
know-
gonna, you're gonna have a reason to say the Birchas HaTorah.
Yeah, right.
Musar, the writings of Rav Yisrael Salanter and all the other Musar teachers. No, we're going, Yaakov, on the Shulchan Aruch said 4 broad categories. Torah, what did he say? He said Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, Medrash. So you might think,
Now, Mikra is Tanakh.
correct,
Megillus Esther is part of Ksuvim.
correct.
After the Sanhedrin, not when
But-
Esther and Mordechai wrote it,
but-
but in
but it-
Sanhedrin.
But a chapter in the Maharal, who's writing on Netzach Yisrael, on Klal Yisrael's Geula and all that, perhaps that's not included because it's not one of the major. Now, what you just said, well, in the Maharal, he's going to bring Psukim, but the question is, maybe since you're not learning it Mamish Mikra from Megillas Esther, maybe it doesn't qualify. That's why they're asking this question. Machshava, Musar, how about Kabbalah? Right? It's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. That's one of the, in Provence 1300, Leon of Kunsi, whatever. We used to think that it was Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, but the Gershon Shalom and the academicians say that it was really the Zohar was published probably in the year 1300. It was based on Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, and that's a machlokes. Some of the traditional sources say no, it's Rav Shimon Bar Yochai completely, but that's a scientific discussion today. But it's clearly not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. So while these disciplines discuss Torah concepts, they do not necessarily deal with an analysis of specific verses, and they do not always address practical mitzvos. So this question was addressed by the Aruch HaShulchan. Right? Aruch HaShulchan passed away 1910, 1920. Rav Epstein. Dashi yesh listapik beloy medivrei Agada k'medrash Rabba Chachmas HaKabbalah im uchilu v'arch b'chas HaTorah. Aruch HaShulchan is questioning. Maybe we don't have to make a bracha on these. A maskona the gamle medrash tzarach levarch mishum shebemedrash loy made gam ken mapsukim mikavachoyim v'gzer shava. He says that for medrash you do need to make, and because there's psukim in there in kavachoyim v'gzer shava, ume'amida shator nedrashes behem. Ulefi zeh mashma shen achiv rak b'dvorim shemeforshim dinei haTorah. The requirement to make a birchas HaTorah isn't just for writings that detail dinim, aval divrei Agada, Kabbalah, but for example, stories or Kabbalah, Torah Sanister, secret ideas, she'eni karam l'dinim balachot. Their main purpose is not for what halacha do you do? How do you do this halacha? So you might think, ain't tzarich bracha. But if you're going to say that the ultimate criteria of when do we say a Birchas HaTorah is, well, was this thing given to Moshe Sinai, and these things were, O mishum dekula Torah mikri, or like the Levush said, it's all called Torah. Pshita shegam haggadah v'Kabbalah nitla Moshe Sinai u'mikru Torah. The Kabbalah that eventually was revealed by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai in the Zohar was given to Moshe Rabbeinu as well. It's called Torah. Avol miloshan Talmidei Rabbeinu Yoina, right, who said that it's got to be exposition and fundamentals of mitzvos, would not be considered. Lo mashmakeh. So he's left with Tzarchiyah and Ledina. When a posek like the Aruch HaShulchan ends up saying Tzarchiyah, it needs more clarification, it means he's a suffix. He's not sure what the din is.
See, anything that you learn these days that's in Ivrit, let's say, or it has a religious connotation, you make a bracha because it helps you understand what the original Torah was.
But the
Anything.
Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah said, unless you have something like the Mishnah and the Talmud that are expositing on verses of the Torah, that explore fundamentals and underpinning of mitzvos, it does not rise to the level. What does Torah mean? Torah means hora. It's a teach. Our Torah isn't a textbook of science. It's not a history book. It teaches us how to do the halacha. That's why the first Rashi in the Torah says what? It should have started with Achodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. How come it
The
started?
Torah says you have to wear tefillin, then, so how do we know
Jerry.
that it's black, that's white, black tefillin? So there's a book, someone wrote a book.
No,
and
that's,
he wrote in there, it says that the tefillin has to be black based on this and this.
no,
source.
that's
Does that
halach
mean
l'Moshe.
I
That's
should-
halach l'Moshe Messina. That's given to Moshe Rabbeinu. We learned that. Black tefillin that has to be
Right.
black is
Well, I'm
directly
just
from
making
Sinai.
a certain thing that a lot of things that you learn right now are explaining what's in the Torah. Every book that you open up is explaining psukim that are in the Torah.
So if it's explaining psukim, the Talmidei of Rabbeinu Yonah would not have argued. It would
Right.
require bracha, but there are
But there
things.
aren't, there's
it-
nothing.
it's
What-
telling a
what
story.
midrash is
How
not-
about the whale? The story about the whale, and no, there's so many midrashim that have nothing to do with psukim in the Torah. They give us a moral
But it
lesson.
gives, but moral lesson
But that's
based
not-
on a pasuk that
No.
said.
No, many
I think you
midrashim
can
have nothing
find
to
out-
do.
you can
Have
find
nothing to do
out.
with the pasuk.
you
But
could-
doesn't this follow the previous section of the Samag, where the brachas on the greatness of the Torah, and therefore these are, sources, sourced from the Torah?
So
Okay,
the
taking it one-
Levush called all of it Torah. The Aruch HaShulchan is pointing out to us that there was a debate, that not everybody saw all of these other aspects of Torah that would fall under the rubric that we would make a bracha for it. Let's see further. The Kaf HaChaim adopts the view of Levush and takes for granted that a person must recite a bracha when studying any aspect of Torah. And that's also the view of the Piskei Teshuvos, and appears to be the commonly accepted practice. The Chavis Yair and Rav Moshe Sternberg are cited as agreeing with this.
Yes, but right.
Agreeing with what? I don't know, I didn't quote the right footnote here. Rav Sternberg calls it even studying Aleph Bet with a child would qualify as Torah study in this context. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Even if you studied Aleph Bet. So
Well,
they
it's
are
because-
they say that it's all Torah.
If you're studying alphabet yourself without a child, if you're reading
Yes.
the alphabet,
Same
that,
thing.
that would be Torah, or because
Yes.
you're teaching the child the alphabet.
It's the same one that would be the same thing. He wants to say you can't learn the Torah unless you learn the Aleph Bet. So the Aleph Bet is a fundamental stepping stone before you get anywhere.
So if you take it one step further, you can say learning Tzurba, we should make a bracha before we learn every night.
Well, Bernie, we've made the bracha in the morning. The bracha lasts for 20. As long as you don't sleep, that's why, like Tikkun Shvuel, Tikkun Leil Shvuas, we always have somebody come. We're going to deal with that. I think they're going to deal with that.
So if someone gives a shiur
But
before
there's a
davening in the
shaila-
morning,
Bernie, there's a shaila if you didn't sleep at night,
Right.
that maybe your bracha continues to the next day. That's why by Tikkun Leil Shvuas, we bring somebody who slept and he makes the bracha, we all answer amen to it. So the bracha that we made to this morning covers us for our learning now. You don't have to make a bracha again. It covers you for 24 hours. Now, let's just read the Kaf HaChaim. Tzorach levarach ben lemikra ben lemishnah, the kula Torah mikra. He says it's all Torah. Quotes the Levush. V'chela divrei haZohar v'Kabbalah. He says v'hu pashut. That's a davar pashut. That if you're going to read the Zohar and the Kabbalah, of course you make a bracha. L'fi ma shekatzu ha'mekubolim. Shedal b'chinas elu mikra mishnah gemor Kabbalah. Heim b'chinas dalad oilamois atzilut bria yitzira asiya. These are spiritual realms of, whatever atzilut means, emanation, creation, yitzira, formation. The Tzurba, thank God, we're not learning Kabbalah.
but further to your point, anybody who's learning Zohar or Kabbalah or anything else, they're learning it during the day. They've said Birchas HaShachar in the morning, they say Birchas HaTorah.
Yeah.
So they've all said it already, but nevertheless, all these Achronim are now talking about making a bracha if you learn these sugyas during the day.
No. Let's say a person's not going to learn anything during the day.
He still has the-
Let's say a person doesn't. So according
He
to
still gets up in the morning and says Birchas HaTorah.
So you, for it not to be a bracha levatala, you need to learn something in that day that fits under the criteria of Torah.
That's davening.
So if during davening, there's korbanos, there's psukim there, there's shema, yes, and but I'm saying the way we learned tonight, even if you didn't learn during the day, according to the Grizz, he says it's for the greatness of Torah that Klal Yisrael couldn't exist without it. It's a birchas hashvach, you would make it anyways. But this is not, so Bernie, these brachas are made in the morning, they cover you all the day. Now let's say you didn't make a bracha in the morning, for whatever reason you were traveling, and you sat down in the afternoon to learn Kabbalah. Yes, you'd have to make a birchas HaTorah. Echanami.
Or if you fell asleep.
For longer than 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, a somewhat related question arises concerning reciting the Birchas HaTorah before reciting Slichos in the early morning. Right? We all come to shul in Elul for Slichos, and we say Slichos, but then the Baal HaSlichos quickly says Birchas HaShachar, right? We start davening Shachars, and most of us then say Birchas HaTorah, and the other bracha is before Birchas HaShachar. The question is, what about all the psukim we recited during Slichos? Before we recited the Birchas HaTorah. On the one hand, the content of these prayers is rich with citations of verses from Tanakh, which would demand the recitation of Birchas HaTorah. However, on the other hand, these verses are certainly recited as supplications, as tefillah, rather than as regular Torah study. The question then is if it matters whether the Torah content is used as study or prayer. So as recorded part of the Shulchan Aruch, this is a subject to a dispute among the Rishonim.
Maybe that's why they daven Slichos at night, some people. They're not doing in the morning. Sometimes they do at 11:30, 12 o'clock every night.
Well, the first Slichos night, the
First time,
Motzai,
but the
we do.
Chassidim usually sometimes do it in the middle of the night.
Okay. Lo yikra psukim kodem birchas haTorah. So the Shulchan Aruch says you shouldn't read psukim of Tanakh before you recited the blessing of the Torah. Afal pishu oimem derech tachanunim. Even though you use these psukim in a supplication way. Yesh oimem shein lachos. Some say no, it's no problem. You can recite slichos without birchas haTorah. Even sheina oimem ela derech tachanunim. Since these psukim are only being recited for tefillah purposes. But nachon lachosh l'svar rishon, says the Shulchan Aruch, you should rely on the first opinion, which is to make the Birchas HaTorah before you recite slichos. Says the Ramah, aval aminik kisvar achroina. That's the Ashkenazic minig. We don't formally recite Birchas HaTorah before we start slichos. The Ashkenazi minig is the second svara, which is that these are psukim only recited derech tachanunim, and they don't require Birchas HaTorah. Like we all do. That after slichos, the shots gets up and it says Birchas HaShachar, and we quietly say the other birchos before Birchas HaShachar to get up to snuff. Reishis Chachma Yiras Hashem, O Torah Hashem Tamima, O Torah Tzivalanu Moshe Moirasha B'Yikilas Yaakov. Some people say these psukim early in the morning before you go to shul. So this is it's an adminig of davening. Our minig is we make al natilas yadayim, then you say asher yotzar. Usually you say Elokai neshama, and then you say Birchas HaTorah. That's in most Ashkenazic Sidurim. The Shulchan Aruch here cites both positions and endorses adhering to the stringent view of reciting Birchas HaTorah even before Slichos. The Ramah writes that the custom was to be lenient and recite Birchas HaTorah after Slichos together with the other Birchas HaShachar. The Ramah then concludes that the more recent custom was to recite Birchas HaTorah after Asher Yotzar, which the Mishnah Berurah explains was recited before the Slichos. So, if so, says the Mishnah Berurah, the practical conclusion is that one should recite Birchas HaTorah before reciting Psukim as part of the Tefillah. Atzlichas, l'fi masha kosav l'kamei dayom no'agu l'varach Birchas HaTorah miyad achar Birchas Asher Yotzar. V'loi lo amar shum Psukim etchil. You shouldn't say any Psukim to begin with. In kein svira lon, the ein lo amar Psukim afilu derech tachanunim korim Birchas HaTorah. He says our minig is to not recite the Psukim unless you made a Birchas HaTorah. In kein yeshlina gam ken b'mei aslichos lo amar Birchas HaTorah korim aslichos u'ledal gelo achar. Not to repeat it when you do the Anatilas Yadayim, because I guess you're going to say Anatilas Yadayim and Asher Yotzar before the Slichos, then Birchas HaTorah, and then you'll pick up with, let's say, Elokai Neshama, or with the just with the Birchas HaShachar. And Rav Mordechai Eliyahu writes similarly. Oisam anoyag and loimer l'shem yichud, koidim kiyum kol mitzvah. So, for example, those that say the l'shem yichud before performing a mitzvah, or pasuk v'yinoyan. You shouldn't say any of this stuff before you recite Birchas HaTorah. You should wait until you say Birchas HaTorah. The Piskei Tshuva agrees in principle with this approach, but mentions a number of exceptions to the rule. Normally, we paskin like the more lenient people, that you don't have to say the bracha. If there's a reason to be mekel, if, for example, somebody's saying Kaddish, Kedusha Baruch Hu, and you haven't said Birchas HaTorah, you can go ahead and recite the response. Or let's say you just got to shul, and the tzibur is now saying the first pasuk of Kriya Shema. You should join them, even though you haven't said Birchas HaTorah yet. See, its time is getting late. Chaim Eisenberg is announcing, right, that it's already time Kriya Shema. And if you recite Birchas HaTorah, you're going to miss its time. You can recite Kriya Shema without the Birchas HaTorah. Daily morning Kriya Shema must be recited in the first quarter of daylight hours, and that'll come later on. Okay, I'm going to stop here. It's a good place to stop. And we'll finish Birchas HaTorah probably next week, and maybe start the halachos of Psukkah de Zimra. These are really very practical halachos for all of us, because they're really daily. So many things that we learned in Yoredeya, and we're very far-fetched. Not the kashrus laws that we learned. Unfortunately, because of our age, some of the nida laws are not that practical. They're practical for our children and some of our grandchildren. But these are really practical for all of us. So, any other comments, questions, oros?
This week's
Point out
parsha.
one thing that,
Yes, Yaakov.
according to many, the reason Tanakh is called Mikra, which means reading, is that you get a mitzvah for just reading them, even if you don't know the translation. Whereas the other, Gemara and the other sources, you actually have to understand what you're saying in order to get a mitzvah for reading them. That's why Tanakh is called Mikra.
Mikra is, he's saying, why is Tanakh called Mikra? Mikra is the word read. So he's pointing out that even if you read a pasuk of Tanakh and you don't understand it, you get a mitzvah. By the other thing, you got to, if you don't understand what you're learning, there's no schar to that. That's a very good point.
This Shabbos, I heard we say chazak, chazak, minis chazek, right?
Yes.
There's a minik, I think it's Sfardi minik. They say a little different. They say chazak, chazak, chazak. What's the difference? Because the gematria of chazak is 115. 3 times chazak, chazak is Moshe Rabbeinu, 345. Moshe.
Nice. It's a good word. Okay, shkoyach everybody.